The scent of cedar and relentless rain usually calmed me. But that evening in our Vancouver loft, it felt like a cold shroud. I wasn't looking for a betrayal when I opened Sophie's laptop to check our final wedding, guest list for the Fairmont Banff, spring ceremony. I was looking for peace. Instead, I found a ghost I had spent 12 years trying to bury. There, highlighted in a soft mocking blue, was the name Elias Thorne, my brother, the man who had turned our family's history in the Ottawa Valley into a graveyard of broken trust and empty bank accounts. I remembered the day I left Ontario, fleeing the wreckage Elias had made of our parents' retirement. He had been a master of the long con, a shadow moving through the capital's underworld, leaving a trail of forged signatures and stolen identities. I had explicitly told Sophie that my life began the day I stopped being my brother's keeper. She had listened with tears in her eyes, or so I thought, as we looked out over the Burrard Inlet. But the spreadsheet told a different story. Not only was he invited to our private mountain wedding, but there were dozens of outgoing transfers to an encrypted account totaling over $5,000. The silence in the room became deafening as Sophie walked in, her damp raincoat smelling of the Pacific woods. I didn't need to speak. The screen reflected in my eyes told her everything. She didn't apologize. Instead, she spoke of healing and family cycles, her voice carrying a chillingly naive resonance. She claimed she had been in contact with him for months, convinced by his tales of a quiet life in a cabin near Revelstoke. Working as a carpenter, she saw herself as the savior of the Thorne lineage, the woman who would bring the prodigal son home under the shadow of the peaks. What she didn't see was that Elias didn't want a home. He wanted a host, and as I sat there, paralyzed by the sight of our wedding fund evaporating, a notification popped up on her phone. It was from Marcus Sterling, our family's new legal consultant who had recently moved from Montreal. He was praising her discretion and bravery. A cold shiver, sharper than a mountain breeze, raced down my spine. Why was our lawyer involved in my brother's return? The following days felt like a slow-motion descent into a crevasse. I called off the engagement within 48 hours, moving my things to a small studio overlooking Stanley Park. Sophie was a wreck of apologies and denials, but the betrayal was academic. It wasn't just the money, it was the breach of the one sanctuary I had left. But the story didn't end with a broken heart. A week later, my credit cards began to decline at every coffee shop on Robson Street. When I checked my accounts, I realized the $5,000 was just the bait, using the information Sophie had unwittingly provided to verify his identity for the guest list. Elias had opened a series of offshore business accounts in Toronto and Calgary under my name. I felt like a hunted man in my own city. That's when Julianne Vane appeared. She was a private investigator, a sharp-featured woman with a penchant for black coffee and a history with the RCMP. She approached me at a diner in Gastown, claiming she had been tracking a series of financial anomalies linked to the Thorne name for years. She didn't look like a savior. She looked like someone who had seen too many winters in the Yukon. She told me that Elias wasn't working alone. The transfers Sophie sent weren't for a second chance. They were payments to satisfy a debt Elias owed to a syndicate operating out of the port of Vancouver. Julianne showed me a photo taken near the Lionsgate Bridge. It showed Elias, looking leaner and more dangerous than I remembered, shaking hands with Marcus Sterling. My blood ran cold. Sterling wasn't just a lawyer. He was the architect. He had targeted Sophie, knowing her empathetic nature, and used her as the bridge to access my clean credit history and my family's remaining assets in the East. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. I was the protagonist of a tragedy I hadn't realized I was starring in, while my fiancé had been groomed to be the unintentional villain. Julianne offered me a choice. I could flee to the island and hide, or I could help her burn their network to the ground. As the fog rolled in from the Georgia Strait, I realized that the man I thought was my brother was merely a weapon being, held by someone much closer to my inner circle. Driving the Coquihalla highway in November is less like a commute and more like a descent into a grey purgatory. The fog rolled off the jagged peaks of the Cascade Mountains, thick and suffocating, mirroring the state of my own mind. I sat in the passenger seat of Julianne Vane's battered truck, watching the wipers struggle against a mix of freezing rain and grit. We were heading east, away from the shattered remains of my life in Vancouver. Only hours before, Julianne had walked into my apartment and dismantled my sense of reality. She had found the tracker, a tiny, professional-grade device sewn into the lining of the designer. Armchair Sophie had insisted we buy, for our forever home. Every conversation, every plan I'd made to rebuild my credit, every moment of grief I'd shared with Sophie had been transmitted directly to Marcus Sterling. As we climbed the steep incline toward the summit, a set of headlights appeared in the mist behind us, maintaining a hauntingly consistent distance. It was a black sedan, the same one Julianne had pointed out in Abbotsford. She didn't speed up. She just gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the leather. She finally broke the silence, not with comfort, but with a revelation that chilled me more than the mountain air. Marcus Sterling wasn't just a lawyer who had stumbled upon my brother's mess. He was the son of a man my father had ruined back in Ontario decades ago. The Thorne family sawmill hadn't just closed. It had been saved by a deal that stripped Sterling's father of everything. This wasn't just a financial scam. It was a multi-generational vendetta. I looked at the passing silhouettes of frozen pines and realized that I was the final payment on a debt I hadn't even known existed. Sophie wasn't a victim of my brother's charm. She was Sterling's most effective operative. She hadn't just invited Elias to our wedding. She had facilitated his entry into the high-stakes world of Vancouver's shadow banking. The money she sent him wasn't for rent or food. It was to buy the silence of the very people who were now following us. Julianne's eyes flickered to the rearview mirror, a predatory glint replacing her usual stoicism. She told me then that we weren't just going to Revelstoke to find Elias. We were going there because the property in the Rockies wasn't just land, it was the only leverage left that could stop Sterling from erasing the Thorne name for good. Revelstoke greeted us with a silence that felt heavy, like the snow accumulating on the cedar boughs. We bypassed the town centre, turning onto a logging road that groaned under the weight of our tires. The cabin sat isolated, a structure of dark timber and glass that looked more like a fortress than a carpenter's retreat. As I stepped out, the smell of wood smoke and old secrets filled my lungs. Julianne didn't knock. She used a key she had pulled from a magnetic box under the porch, a move that made me realize her connection to this place was far more intimate than she had let on. Inside, the cabin was a surgical display of betrayal. There were no wood shavings or half-finished furniture. Instead, a wall was covered in printouts of my bank statements, mapped out like a battlefield. But the most devastating find was a leather-bound journal on the kitchen island. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was Sophie's elegant, looping script. It wasn't a diary of love. It was a logbook. She had documented every weakness I had. My password patterns, my guilt over our parents' bankruptcy, the exact location of the safety deposit box in Toronto where the original land deeds were kept. She hadn't been groomed by Marcus. She had been his partner in this long con from the very beginning. The chance meeting at the Kitsilano beach 3 years ago had been a planned extraction. As I stood there, reeling from the realization that my entire romantic life had been a staged performance, Julianne opened a hidden compartment in the floor. She pulled out a heavy steel box and entered a code with practiced ease. "How do you know the code?" I asked, my voice cracking in the cold air. She looked up, her face illuminated by the flickering overhead light. "Because I'm the one who changed it before. Elias tried to sell the rights to Marcus. Behind my back," she replied. She wasn't just an investigator or an ex-cop. She was Elias's former partner, his wife from a life he'd lived in the Yukon before he ever returned to Ontario. She wasn't here to help me. She was here to claim her share of the Thorne legacy. We were all predators and prey in this house, and as the sound of a second car approaching echoed through the valley, I realized that the man I called my brother was coming to finish the job, and he wasn't alone. The roar of a high-end engine cut through the muffled silence of the falling snow, a sound that didn't belong in the deep wilderness of the Selkirks. From my vantage point behind a stack of seasoned cedar logs, I watched a black SUV crawl up the icy incline. When the doors opened, the betrayal I had felt in Vancouver seemed like a mere scratch compared to the wound that was about to be opened. Marcus Sterling stepped out, looking perfectly composed in a charcoal overcoat that cost more than my first car. But it was the person who followed him that stopped my heart. Sophie. She wasn't bound. She wasn't crying. She was holding a thermal flask, handing it to Marcus with a familiarity that suggested years, not months of intimacy. My brother Elias emerged from the driver's seat like a shadow cast by a dying fire. He looked haggard, his movements twitchy, the unmistakable signs of a man who had spent his life running from debts he could never repay. He didn't look like a mastermind. He looked like a pawn. The three of them stood in the clearing, the wind howling around them like the ghosts of the Thorne family. I watched as Marcus pulled a satellite phone and a heavy leather folder from the trunk. The folder contained the deeds Julianne and I had just discovered. They weren't there for a family reunion or a simple fraud. They were there to finalize the liquidation of the Thorne estate, a vast tract of timberland that sat atop one of the richest lithium deposits in Western Canada. The realization hit me with the force of an avalanche. Sophie hadn't just been conned by Elias. She had been the scout. Marcus was the architect, and Elias was the expendable fall guy. I looked at Julianne, who was crouched beside me, her hand resting on the holster of a Glock 17. Her face was a mask of calculated fury. She wasn't looking at Elias or Sophie. Her eyes were locked on Marcus Sterling. In that moment, I realized Julianne wasn't here for justice or for me. She was the side protagonist whose mission was to ensure that the lithium rights never reached the open market, likely working for a rival energy consortium. The air between us grew thick with the smell of ozone and impending violence. I was caught between a fiancé who had sold my soul and a savior who was likely just another predator in a different skin. The wind shifted, carrying the metallic tang of the SUV's exhaust toward us. Marcus began spreading the maps across the hood of the car, gesturing toward the valley below with a proprietary air that made my skin crawl. He started speaking, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp mountain air. He wasn't talking to Elias. He was talking to Sophie about their new life in Zurich. Once the transfer was verified, the betrayal was complete. My life in Vancouver, our shared dreams of a house in North Vancouver, the weekends hiking the Chief. It had all been a long-term investment for them. I was the signature they needed to unlock the Thorne legacy. And once I was no longer useful, I was meant to be the tragic victim of a brotherly dispute that went wrong. Julianne moved with the silence of a lynx. She didn't wait for a signal. She stepped out from behind the logs, but she didn't aim at Marcus. She aimed at the engine block of the SUV and fired 2 silenced rounds. The hiss of escaping steam filled the clearing. The dynamic shifted instantly. Marcus didn't panic. He reached into his coat with a practiced smoothness, but Sophie was faster. She pulled a small silver-plated pistol from her parka. The same parka. I had bought her for our anniversary, and pointed it directly at Julianne's head. The innocent woman I loved was gone, replaced by someone with ice in her veins, and a steady hand that spoke of professional training. In that moment of frozen tension, I stepped out into the light. I didn't have a gun. I only had the folder of documents I had taken from the cabin. I held it over the edge of the steep ravine that dropped 300 feet into the icy waters of the Illecillewaet River. The shift in their eyes was the only victory I needed. Marcus looked at the papers. Elias looked at me with a mixture of shame and terror. And Sophie looked at me with absolute indifference. It was the indifference that hurt the most. I realized then that the side antagonist wasn't Marcus or Elias. It was the system that Julianne represented. She wasn't here to arrest them. She stepped forward and whispered that if I dropped those papers, she would make sure I never left the mountain alive. She needed those documents for her employers, just as much as Marcus needed them for his. I was standing between 2 monsters, holding the only thing that kept them from killing each other. And me. The wind over the Illecillewaet ravine didn't just howl. It screamed with a primal ferocity that seemed to vibrate in my very marrow. I stood on the precipice, the soles of my hiking boots slipping on the treacherous mix of black ice and pine needles. In my hands, I clutched the heavy leather folder, the only thing standing between the Thorne legacy and total erasure. Marcus Sterling took a step toward me, his charcoal overcoat fluttering like the wings of a scavenger bird. His face was a masterpiece of controlled malice. He began to speak, his voice cutting through the gale with a sharp, rhythmic precision. He spoke of the 1990s in the Ottawa Valley, of a sawmill contract my father had signed that had functionally ended the Sterling family's prominence. For him, this wasn't merely a corporate acquisition of lithium-rich land. It was a ritual of restoration. He wanted to see the Thorne name dragged through the same mud his father had drowned in. Sophie stood to his left, her silver-plated pistol held with a professional rigidity that made my stomach churn. She wasn't the woman I had shared coffee with every morning in Kitsilano. She was a ghost, a hollowed-out version of the person I loved, filled with the cold directives of a handler. She looked at me not with hatred, but with a terrifying, clinical indifference. "Drop the folder, Adam," she said, and the sound of my name in her mouth felt like a violation. There was no tremor in her hand, no hesitation in her eyes. She was a sniper in a parka, waiting for the wind to drop just enough to make the shot count. I realized then that every "I love you" had been a calibration, every intimate moment a data point for this final confrontation. The tension broke not with a shot, but with the arrival of the black sedan. It skidded to a halt near the cabin, and a man in a Parks Canada uniform stepped out. For a heartbeat, I thought of salvation, but as he approached, Marcus and whispered a status report about the cleared perimeter. I saw the tactical gear beneath his jacket. He wasn't a ranger. He was a private contractor, the kind of muscle that operates in the gray zones of the Canadian wilderness. I was surrounded by a lawyer's ancient grudge, a fiancé's cold-blooded professionalism, and a mercenary's lethal efficiency. As the sleet turned into a blinding whiteout, I looked at the drop behind me and realized that my only way out was to play the two monsters against each other. The first shot missed my ear by inches, the crack of the silenced pistol muffled by the roaring river below. I didn't wait for a second. I dove into the dense undergrowth of western red cedars, the branches clawing at my face like skeletal fingers. Behind me, I heard the heavy boots of the mercenary and the high-pitched commands of Marcus. But it was Julianne who moved with the most terrifying speed. She wasn't firing. She was circling. As I scrambled through the deep snow, I saw my brother, Elias, near the SUV. He didn't run to me. Instead, he did something that shifted the entire chessboard. He threw a heavy wrench through the radiator of the black sedan and dove into the brush in the opposite direction. He wasn't saving me. He was creating chaos to ensure his own escape. I reached the old suspension bridge, a swaying relic of the gold rush era that spanned the narrowest, most violent part of the Illecillewaet. The cables were encrusted in ice, groaning like a dying animal under the wind's pressure. I was halfway across when the silhouette of Sophie appeared at the far end, her pistol leveled at my heart. "Give it to me, Adam. Julianne won't let you live either. She's working for the West Coast Syndicate. No one is the hero here," she screamed over the wind. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Julianne, the PI who had led me here, was just another player for a different set of masters. I was a pawn in a war between two energy conglomerates, and the documents in my hand were the only currency that mattered. Then came the final twist. Elias emerged from the shadows behind Sophie. I expected him to tackle her, to save his brother. Instead, he placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered something I couldn't hear. She lowered her gun. My brother wasn't the victim, and he wasn't the pawn. He had been the one who recruited Sophie 3 years ago. He had groomed her to find me, to lure me into this trap so he could sell the Thornland to the highest bidder, either Marcus or Julianne's employers. The entire estrangement had been a long con designed to make me trust the first person who offered me a way out. I looked at the three of them, the brother who sold me, the woman who betrayed me, and the agent who used me. I looked at the documents, then at the churning white water 300 feet below. With a final bitter laugh, I realized that the only way to win a rigged game was to burn the board. I let the folder slip from my fingers, watching the legacy of the Thorn family scatter into the icy mist like autumn leaves in a storm. The silence that followed the documents hitting the churning water was more violent than the storm itself. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Marcus Sterling's face transformed from a mask of cold calculation into a gargoyle of pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't scream, he lunged. But he wasn't lunging for me. He was lunging for the bridge's railing, as if he could somehow pull the legacy of the Thorn family back from the icy throat of the river. Sophie, however, remained rooted to the spot, her silver pistol still aimed at my chest. I saw the calculation in her eyes. Without the deeds, I was no longer a golden ticket. I was a liability, the only witness to a conspiracy that had just dissolved into a cloud of frozen spray. The first crack of gunfire didn't come from Sophie. It came from the tree line where Julianne Vane had vanished. A flare, brilliant and blood-red, arched over the ravine, illuminating the chaos. In the strobe-like light, I saw the ranger mercenary drop to his knees, clutching a shoulder wound. Julianne emerged from the mist, but she wasn't alone. Figures in tactical gear, silent as the shadows they inhabited, began to close the circle. They weren't RCMP, and they weren't private contractors. They were the security wing of the very conglomerate. Julianne had mentioned the rival power that had been waiting for the deal to fail. Julianne hadn't been a detective or an agent. She was a cleanup crew. Her mission was simple. If the Thornland couldn't be bought, it had to be buried. Elias, my brother, saw the shift in power before anyone else. With the practiced cowardice of a man who had survived 1,000 betrayals, he didn't try to help Sophie or Marcus. He turned and sprinted toward the SUV, but the tires he had sabotaged himself became his own cage. As the shadows closed in, Marcus turned his fury on Sophie, blaming her for losing the asset. The domestic drama I had been living for 3 years reached its toxic peak on that swaying bridge. I watched as the two people who had dismantled my life began to tear each other apart. In the confusion, I stepped backward, letting the shadows of the cedar boughs swallow me. I didn't need to be the hero. I just needed to be the ghost. I crawled through the freezing undergrowth, my lungs burning with the alpine air, leaving the monsters to fight over the echoes of a fortune that was now at the bottom of the river. By the time I reached the main road, the sirens of the RCMP were echoing through the valley, a blue and red pulse against the monochromatic snow. Julianne's cleaners had vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Marcus, Sophie, and Elias to explain the presence of illegal firearms and a sabotaged SUV to the real authorities. I sat on a stump by the roadside, my hands trembling not from the cold, but from the sudden, hollow vacuum of my freedom. I watched from the darkness as the police led Sophie away in handcuffs. She looked smaller, her defiance replaced by a shivering realization that the grand plan had ended in a muddy ditch in the Selkirks. Marcus Sterling was screaming about lawyers and rights, but in the heart of the Rockies, his Montreal influence was as thin as the mountain air. 2 months later, Vancouver felt like a different planet. I stood on the balcony of my new apartment in Lower Lonsdale, looking across the Burrard Inlet at the city lights. The legal fallout had been a slow-motion car crash. Elias had taken a plea deal, testifying against Marcus and Sophie to shave years off his own sentence for identity theft and fraud. It was his final betrayal, and for the first time in my life, I was grateful for his lack of loyalty. Sophie was facing charges that would keep her behind bars for a long time. Her reputation as a rising star in the legal world incinerated by the evidence Julianne had conveniently leaked to the press before disappearing into the shadows of the corporate world. I often thought about the folder at the bottom of the Illecilluette. The lithium deposits were still there, untapped, protected by the very act of destruction. I had received a letter, postmarked from Whitehorse, with no return address. Inside was a single key to a safety deposit box in a small bank in Jasper and a note that read, "For the protagonist who knew when to burn the board." It was from Julianne. I never went to Jasper. I didn't need the money, and I didn't need another legacy. I spent my days hiking the North Shore trails, finding a quiet rhythm in the cedar and the rain. I had lost a fiancé and a brother, but I had gained the one thing the Thorne family had never possessed, a life that wasn't built on someone else's ruins. The detective story of my life had concluded not with a conviction, but with a clean slate, written in the snow and washed away by the mountain rivers.